And on behalf of the OPC, I'm delighted to welcome you to this screening of The Perfect Story, a film by filmmaker Michelle Shephard, produced by Frequent Flyer Productions with the National Film Board of Canada. We're also thrilled to have Michelle with us this evening for Q&A after the event, after the screening. So please look forward to that. It will be held with Anna Mela Papernay, and we welcome you to the show. So please enjoy the film. Thank you so much.
It's not the film we set out to make. We were talking about this earlier, and we don't really go into that in the film, but we started out, he just wanted to go back to Somalia, and he asked if I would record it. And we'd been talking stayed friends over the years, and I was starting to move a little bit from newspapers into filmmaking more. And so he had said, listen, someday I want to go back once I get my citizenship. Let's make a documentary together. And I thought that was a great idea. So that was the film we were making. I had no intention of being in the film as much as I was. I could definitely say it'll be the only time I'm on that side of the camera ever in a film again. But as you saw in the film, what happened was when he went back to Mogadishu, he kind of had this epiphany and this moment. And then it became, and we can get into all these questions, but then it became really a challenge, ethically, morally. Do we continue with this film? If we do, what does it become? And all the while making sure he was okay, trying to give him as much agency to tell his own story. And in the end, he agreed to keep going. He decided that this was the way he wanted to correct the record. And then the film changed. Then it became a film about journalism, because it was no longer sort of about our relationship or his story as much. It was about what do we do in journalism? How do we tell stories? Are we storytellers or are we story takers? And it was really uncomfortable. I mean, it was probably about 5 years making that, and a lot of starts and stops, and not sure we were doing the right thing with it. So it is one of those films that it makes you uncomfortable. And I always say this when it showed at Hot Docs, and sort of at the beginning, I was like, well, welcome, thank you. This is going to be hard to watch, which is a weird thing to say when you start a film. But I want people to kind of feel uncomfortable. I want people to have questions and leave and talk more about it.
What made you decide to do that? It's hard to turn the camera on yourself as a reporter.
Yeah, well, I think I felt like I had a responsibility, though, really, because, that's what we do in journalism. We always ask people to tell their stories to us and to give us that trust. So I think in this sense, it really made me question how much I was a part of him telling this story. And it made me question, in general, what we do, especially when you're a foreign correspondent, and especially the type of foreign correspondent that I was. When I was at the Star, I was their national security correspondent, but I was always based in Toronto. So I would just go in and out for various periods. And that was often called sort of parachute jumping, which is a derogatory term really for journalism. And I get why it is, and it can be. I like to think, and I'm not sure I always did it well, but I tried. I like to think that what I was doing was because I understood my beat so well, that I would be going to places and I would understand the context of those stories. And so much of what I did in national security was about policy and what happened after 9/11 and all those policies. So at bigger papers, you would have the Washington people reporting about, let's say, drone attacks. And then you'd have maybe someone in the Yemen bureau reporting about that. I got to see both sides, so I got to go to, Washington and see the debate about that policy that came in. But then I also got to go to Yemen and see what happens when a drone hits a wedding party instead of an intended target. So for me, I thought it worked. But certainly this story made me challenge a lot of what we did. And I felt, ultimately, I just felt so sad for him because he was so smart. Like he was right. If he told me the truth right off the bat, I still would have done the story. Absolutely. It was barbaric what happened to him. But would the fallout have been the same? Like, I'm not sure. I'm not sure there would have been that, movement to try and quote unquote rescue him, because he would have said, he was a thief, and he still deserves all the empathy he got and all the support he got. Absolutely. But would he have? I'm not sure.
so many of the stories that we tell are by their nature really messy. They're really complicated. But what do you do about sort of this inclination, whether it's conscious or not, to gravitate towards, the perfect story, to gravitate towards that sort of simplicity of narrative?
Well, and that's where I had to look at myself, and that's what the conversations I'm hoping it sparks about this, because we met actually first time reporting from Guantanamo Bay, and when you were with the Globe and I was with the Star. So talk about a complicated story, right there. I spent many years. I did another documentary on the Omar Khadr story. Many years reporting on that. That was a messy story. I mean, every time I report anything on that, I get like people enraged on both sides. And I liked that. And I thought, well, but it is complicated because it's not a tidy narrative. And most of the stories out of Guantanamo were like that. But I think after, almost 20 years of doing that, it's exhausting. There is a part of you that really likes that kind of Hollywood tidy narrative. So I think it's a hard question to answer. How do you not do that? I think just being aware that you're drawn to those stories makes you maybe, question things or not look for them in the same way. Not simplify stories.
You have to almost be like withholding, not just from yourself, but from audiences and from editors often. Like you can tell that there's a desire in you as well as everyone else for things to be neat and tidy.
Totally.
And you have to remind yourself that actually it's not.
Totally. I mean, would I have gotten the same play in this story, if it'd been a little bit different? Maybe not, maybe not the front of the insight section, or we know that all the time, that editors will kind of be like, oh, that's unfortunate about this. Or I remember one terrible case after 9/11. I was in New York covering 9/11, and there was a Canadian widow there. Her husband had died in the towers, and she was a lovely woman. It was 5 days later, I think it was. She was pregnant. She was leaving, and she was one of people who still were hopeful that their relatives were alive. And she gave us this beautiful interview, and she's like, "Now I need to get home to my toddler. I know he's not there." And so it's a very brave, sort of moving story. And an editor calling saying, like, "Why isn't she crying in the picture?" And she's like, "Because she didn't cry." It's like, well, can you go back? This is terrible. I won't say who the editor was, but I mean, the story didn't go up it wasn't the front page because you didn't have the crying widow. So I mean, those decisions get made, right? And so I think as journalists who are actually out in the field, you have to always stay true to what it is. But there is this, as you say, this preference for that's why we called it the perfect story.
Do you think what do we do about the ways we're complicit in romanticizing places like Somali and Mogadishu, stories like Ismail's?
Yeah, again, this is the discomfort. And, I wrote a companion piece that went with this film that I always kind of hope people read, because there's only so much you can see in the film, so much you always need some, something visual to show. I already editorialized a lot in it, but yeah, I mean, that's what made me feel sick about it a little bit. Like, I was like, oh God, this sounds like smacks of sort of white saviorism. And I turn him into this perfect victim because that's what people need to see. It's just this gross kind of caricature of what a victim of war looks like. Again, I think it's just always keeping in check your lens that you look at. I'd like to think over the span of career, that's not what I did. And certainly what I think, there's a lot of amazing work that's being done in the field by experienced foreign correspondents, but it's something you definitely have to always keep in check. Absolutely.
Has this changed the way you approach other stories?
I think so, a little bit. And I mean, I'm not doing that kind of daily journalism anymore in the same way. Now I'm doing, I left the Star in 2018, so I've gone independent. So now I'm doing more films and podcasts, which are my new favorite medium because it gives you like 3 hours to tell a story. You have somebody captive for that long. So you can really get into the nuances of it. But yeah, I think so. I think in sort of small ways. It was interesting when I wrote the piece for the Star, because I also had to correct the record there, came out with this, and our ombud wrote who's a friend of mine, wrote a companion piece with it, and was, critical in some ways, said that maybe I hadn't done the right fact checking. And I actually, I mean, I respect that he had to do the piece, but that I actually disagree with, because I think, one, I mean, good luck fact checking in a war zone when you're riding around with African Union forces and basically embedded. Like, there was just some logistics that you couldn't, and we did our due diligence in other ways. But I also think it's equally important in those situations to have a duty of care for those that you're interviewing, and Ismail was totally traumatized as to what happened to him. So I wouldn't want to become so cynical that I would have, badgered him. Like, are you sure this is what happened? And re-traumatize him in this. Like, there is a real duty of care that you have to have when you're in the field. So I think it's a fine balance. And I mean, those were when the film, part of our discomfort with this film, which was sort of the whole time. But when it came out, we're very thankful that it's actually had a really receptive audience. Every screening we've done has been really thoughtful, good comments, because our fear coming out was that people we didn't do a good job in explaining it, and people would come away, with xenophobia, or like, well, see, all refugees lie, and see, the media is fake, like, which are the two sort of little racist and ignorant phrases that we hear a lot today. So we certainly didn't want to add to that conversation, but thankfully it hasn't.
Oh, good.
So yeah, or we've had the right people watching the film, maybe.
Nice. I mean, realistically though, like, is there anything that you think you should have done differently, in 2009?
I think if I looked back in the way I wrote the story, I would have done it a little bit differently. I think, just in the language of, as you said, like, kind of romanticizing it in a way. I might have it was, interestingly enough, he was just the start of a story about what was happening at the time. So it wasn't entirely about him. There was a lot of context, but I think, I think the words you use, how you frame it, I might have done it a little less sensationally in a way. But it's more, I'm not sure. It was more like a thinking in a larger way at how we go at these stories than any kind of specific. Like, I definitely should have, I mean, the ironic thing was the only people that were telling the truth at that time was the Shabab. I mean, they had actually said, to put out at that time, they had a press agent who he was very, who often emailed, and he actually said in the email that he had been a thief, and which I put in the story that they said that. But obviously we also know that they did a lot of stories that were just pure propaganda. So
one of the biggest tensions for me watching this was your relationship with Ismail and his relationship to the story. What do you think, as journalists, we owe our sources?
That's a really good question. And some people say, you got close with him. Can you ever? Should you do that? And I guess it's two separate questions. But I do think the longer I've been in journalism, this idea of being objective is just false. There's just absolutely no way you can be objective. We all bring lenses to what we cover. And I think as long as you recognize that, then that's important. I mean, the longer I covered national security, the more of a lens I came, but I think the reporting got better. I mean, it was at some point I'm like, yeah, that's just a lie. I mean, the Pentagon is just saying a lie. I can't give it equal weight to what, someone else is saying. So, but in terms of relationships too, I mean, that was definitely the closest I've ever come to anybody. And I don't think I would do that. If I had a similar scenario, I don't think I would do that differently. I wasn't forcing a relationship. I mean, anytime I'd go to Norway, I'd see him, and we just had sort of a fun friendship, like an older sister type friendship. I did keep telling his story, but we had a relationship outside of that. Having said that, it made it incredibly complicated. And when we were filming, it was funny, before we knew what he came forward with the truth, we were kind of having trouble with filming because I didn't want to film. I wanted him to look good. I wanted him, I think the cinematographer, who's really great, was probably frustrated with me at times. I'm like, okay, camera on, camera off. I mean, you don't do that in documentaries, right? Like, for that kind of cinema verite, you just kind of roll with it, see where it goes. But I'd be like, are you comfortable? Is it like, there was this real kind of, I wanted him to look really good on I didn't want it to be messy. I wanted him to put his best, foot forward. And he wanted that. So he was kind of performing. Probably some of our best honest moments came when we weren't rolling, so in terms of filmmaking, that was a lesson, but also it's tough when you are close to somebody.
It's something I read, obviously on a very different scale, but like I still wrestle with, what do I owe someone if they're telling me something that is really valuable, but that might get them in trouble? Do I say something?
Right.
If they want to be identified, but I think being identified might be a bad idea, do they get to choose that? Do I tell them this is a bad idea? If they ask me for help after the story runs, I still wrestle with that. I don't know.
Me too. And sorry, that was more your question. In this case, he wanted the story told, sort of all along the way. He was the one driving. He was the one driving the documentary. So it was a little bit different, but definitely you face that all the time. And I always laugh that I think the longer I did that kind of work or that kind of daily journalism, the worse journalist I became, because I would never promise anyone anything. Like I'd be like, you can talk to me. Probably won't do anything. Like you might face this hate. And I really would talk people out of it. They'd be like, no, I actually want to talk to you. Can you shut up and get your recorder going? But I do think, I think there is people don't realize what happens. Like we realize it because we know what happens. And, we get that barrage too on especially now on social media. But I feel like you really do have that duty to explain to people what it means to put yourself out there. But I mean, ultimately people have to decide. Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, it depends. We're talking about victims. Sometimes there's people that obviously need to be held to account. That's a different scenario. But when it's that kind of situation, I tend to now go, like, I'd rather not have the story and not have someone talk to me than to have them call me, 2 weeks later and be like, I lost my job. That happened. I now have to, move because I'm getting such a barrage of hate.
Does that mean, like, are we responsible for calculating the consequences, do you think? Or is it enough for us to say, this probably won't help you. It could hurt you in these ways. Yeah. I'm turning my recorder on now.
Yeah, I think it's a case by case, but because you can't predict where a story is going to go anyway. I remember when telling Ismail's story, it was at a period where I was starting to burn out a little bit, and especially with the whole, quote unquote war on terror, because it felt like such a fear factory. And I remember thinking, no one's going to care about this. Like, it was so devastating, and I'd seen a lot in various conflicts. And I'd seen a lot, especially in Somali, which tended to be a very misunderstood country. Sort of never moved past what people think of like Black Hawk Down and Captain Phillips. So I remember being a bit like, no one's, and then it surprised me that it had, then it went viral. So you never really know, but I think you just do your best to be responsible and just, when you're talking with someone that they don't know the consequences. And I think there's a responsible way to explain it. And ultimately it's up to people whether or not they want to talk.
And then on a personal level, what do you do with that sort of soul-killing conviction that you're not going to make a difference?
Sometimes you do. I mean, it's just, it's hard. I mean, a lot of times I miss daily journalism. I certainly, miss the travel and having this front row seat to some incredible periods of history. But I don't miss that part of it. I don't miss the turning on Twitter, firing up your laptop, and you've got 27 people spewing hate at you, before you've had your first coffee, and also now the news cycle goes so fast, right? It's really hard. It used to be easier. Because I started with Star in the 90s, and it used to be easier to make a difference because you had that one big investigation. It's the only thing anyone would read. Yeah. And now it's like you're lucky if you're, top of the website for a couple hours. So it is harder. But it's still, I mean, we're talking negatively, but it's still really, in a way, it's never mattered more, of course. It's just that the fight to get the sort of truth out there and to get people to respect journalism is harder, but it really matters. And so when you do have those stories that make a difference, and honestly, even if like this, if one person watches the film and thinks a little bit differently about the kind of stories they consume, or story, I always give the example of, when we had an influx of Syrian refugees here, or Afghan refugees recently, like everyone wanted the photo of like Trudeau kissing the refugee at the airport with a Canadian flag. And you want the story, which is a great story about somebody who's opened the Queen Street West restaurant and is doing really well. You want to celebrate that. But, when you would pitch stories about mental health issues and how tough it is when those were harder stories to sell. So if somebody, but they matter. And so if somebody watches a film like this and thinks, oh, I should really alter my expectations in even the way I consume news, then in a small way, you're making a difference. You're just changing a perception, and that's important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of response did you get from people like involved with the project, Ismail?
Lovely. We actually filmed with them, and then we couldn't work it into the film. But yeah, because you saw the scene, like when he came to Toronto and he had that moment. So it was just wonderful, actually. When he came back to Toronto, he met many of the leaders, and they're like, we understand. It's fine. You deserved everything you got. So it's been really good. Yeah. And Norway so far hasn't. We did worry at one point. We, hired a lawyer to see if it would impact his immigration, and before the film ran, and the advice was no. But you never know with politics and what could happen. But so far, it's all been fine.
Can they do that? Can they take away your citizenship?
Luckily, he was a citizen, but you can. There are cases that it can happen if you lie, but the lie is so small. I mean, he was a refugee and needed protection, but there have been cases, yeah.
I'm constantly struck. Most of the immigration stories I do are from Canada, but I'm constantly struck by the expectation of perfection, like murderously hard work and constant gratitude. It's like it never goes away. It doesn't matter the generation, doesn't matter the country of origin, although non-white immigrants, non-Anglophone immigrants face much harder hurdles. But we just expect gratitude and perfection from everybody.
Yeah, it's really well said. It's so true. Yeah. And that's why you can see, that's why I say he was so smart at 17, knowing that he had to create a little bit of a different narrative.
Did he ever say like where like he got that idea? Like, was it watching something? It's incredibly savvy.
That's a good question. I should have asked him that. Yeah, I don't know. He's a smart kid. I don't know. I'm sure he'd seen other cases. Yeah.
He's seen this.
He has seen this. So we actually, we had a great team at NFB and TVO who were the funders for this film, because I don't think you always get this in the documentary world. But we held the film for quite a while till he was ready to see it. As you can clearly see, I mean, he's having some pretty serious mental health issues at various times. And so he didn't want to see it for a long time. So we wanted to make sure he was prepared for it to come out. So we did. It was during COVID, unfortunately, but we watched it together online, and we recorded his response, and he was actually really. Again, we were going to work it into the film. It didn't work in, but he was really. He was really astute. He's like, some people will see this film and get it. Some people absolutely won't. And he sort of did a breakdown, which I think are all the reactions that have happened to some degree. But he gave permission, which again is a weird thing in journalism, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't, once someone tells a story, I think it would be a firing offense at the Star if I showed that story to, I'm looking at Star colleagues back in former, so just like big nods back there. Yeah, you would get, that's a firing offense. You don't get editorial say. So this was another weird ethical dilemma, which makes documentary filmmaking a bit different from daily journalism, a lot different in some ways. I felt like he had to see it.
And if he'd said no, you just would have killed it?
We didn't get there, and I don't know what would have happened. Yeah, thankfully we didn't get there. But that we would have done something. I mean, if there were reasons that were ethical that we couldn't do it, or if it was going to impact him to the point that this was going to harm him, then there's the film's not that important that it's if it was gonna harm him. But he said it was okay to go out. And but he hasn't come for the screenings. I mean, we wanted him to be here in Toronto, and he really doesn't want any. He really wants to move on, and it's kind of sad. We don't really talk. I mean, we still text once in a while, but we don't talk really the same. I think he's quite fairly said. Every time he talks to me, he just thinks the film and his past, and it's hard.
How's he doing?
He's actually back visiting in Mogadishu right now with his family. Yeah, so we went back. He was in Norway for a long time. He just went back recently. So he seems to be doing okay. Yeah.
Can he sponsor family to come to join him? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I think he can actually apply for that in Norway. Yeah. Yeah. Originally, I'd hoped he was coming to Canada. I mean, that was when we first met. But Norway was just the fastest with offering him refuge. So
the image of him like on his hands and knees trying to pick up the pin was like, because it happens. You get people, you do an interview, and then they're like, okay, help me come to Canada, help me get my children. Like, yeah.
And the setting of that too. I mean, it was at a time when it was still the conflict was it was after the worst of the war, but the conflict was still going on. So, the way the interview happened was, it was the only time actually I reported there, and I actually was sort of quote unquote embedded because you couldn't get around town any other way. So I'm in a flak jacket, helmet. I've just driven in with African Union forces, who were like the peacekeeping force at the time. Excuse me. And, it's near curfew. We drive in these big tanks that are called Caspirs. They're these big monster trucks. And they're like, you have 10 minutes. What? And we pushed it to like 90 minutes or whatever I had. But they're like, we're leaving you here. We got like screaming at me. This is the environment. This poor kid's trying to tell me a story. We're taking a picture. Yeah. And so the last image I have is I'm literally being dragged out and running out. He's asked for the pin on my bag, like a Canadian pin. I give it to him and he drops it. And I'm just like, this is just, yeah, it really, it's a terrible, gross feeling. And you feel the real divide and this gross privilege for being able to run out of there. Yeah.
Is it possible for us to do stories, especially in places where we're the foreign journalist, that aren't extractive?
I like to hope so. I mean, I think now journalism has opened up in such a way, mainly for good, in the last like 10 to 15 years, where there's just so much more local reporting, and so I think what I hope to see happen more and more is still partnerships. I mean, you still need sort of sometimes the experience, but there's a great journalist in the UK, Mary Harper, who's done a lot in Somali, and she started a program now for local female journalists, and they're like freelancing out. So I think once you get a more robust, Somalia is a tough country in terms of independent journalism. There's a lot of countries that are tough, but it's particularly hard there. But I think the more and more you get that, then you're just going to get stories that feel less extractive, of course. Yeah.
I mean, I realized I said that. I didn't want to insinuate that your reporting had
No.
But I just like, it's a fear of mine that I just don't.
Of course, that was the whole discomfort with this story and what it made you feel. And it was always something you think of. Of course it is when you go into a country and you just by way of the fact that you're going in and being able to leave when local journalists can't, and you have the money to pay for protection, and there's just a total gap. So you're always seeing stories through that lens. And it's kind of just inevitable in some places at that time. But I think that has started to change in ways. But even having said that, though, I mean, it's as you know, like it's almost, you never work in countries without the support of local journalists anyway. I mean, you work in partnership. And a lot of times in some of the countries I would work in, we would partner, and the Star was good about offering to co-byline, so but a lot of times the journalists wouldn't want that because again, if it's critical, you get to leave, and they don't.
Yeah. I've been monopolizing Michelle. Are there questions from the audience? Anybody want to ask them a question? Yeah, I think we have a mic.
Is it? Oh yeah. Um, I, sorry, I'm kind of overwhelmed. But earlier in the film, there was talking about like if you're on a beach in Greece and you see the migrants in the water, do you take the picture or do you go help? And it just got me thinking, and the whole movie got me thinking, like, when do you specifically, but also just one, like, when do you turn the journalism off? Like, what, and also just as a human, like, I'm a human, I'm making friends. How do I do that in a way that, like, I'm not always in journalism mode? I'm not always thinking these are sources. When do I be a person as well?
Yeah, a really good question. And when Anthony Feinstein said he works with a lot of journalists who have PTSD and moral injury and other issues because of those questions. For some reason, I always kind of flinch a little bit when people say, when am I a human and when am I a journalist? Because it implies that journalists aren't humans. And I think the longer you do it, especially. But I think for most of us, if you go into journalism, and you're doing this type of journalism, it's because you want to make a difference. And so your instincts to help are really first and foremost. And I think, it does help the longer you do it, because I think where you do get into trouble is where there's that pressure when you're starting out. That's what I often say to journalism schools. And it's easy to say that when you're, 50 and you've been doing it for a while, but it's tough. I remember what it was like to be, you have to get that story, right? Like you have to prove yourself. And that's where I think sometimes you can get into trouble, because it's never, I always say it's never worth a story if you injure somebody. It's if you ruin someone's life because of what you've done or traumatize them. It's never worth that story. There's always going to be another story. Like it's way better to get beat than to have that. So I think it's not necessarily something that I can say, always make sure you do this and check in this. It's just by experience, and you realize that. But there's also you have to realize in certain situations you can't help everyone. You're still there, like you're not a humanitarian worker. You're still there to do a job, and you actually just can't help everybody, so you have to remember you're trying to help them by bringing the truth and writing the stories. That's your job. So you do that the best you can, but never at the, at the cost of somebody else. But I've never had a scenario quite like he describes there, which I know friends who have, and it's especially tough, especially on photojournalists. It's a real, like, do you get that shot? And well, exactly as he said, like, where do you go? And it's devastating.
Oh, first and foremost, I want to thank you for being here. I thought the documentary was well done. My question to you actually is actually in regards to the film. From your perspective, do you think that he was a bit pressured towards like everything at the end because of how the story shed light and how it was covered? Do you think he was pressured to reveal the truth about what happened? And like, how did you go about it when you found out?
Yeah, really good questions, because that's stuff that doesn't really come out in the film. Again, just by necessity of, unless I am on camera just saying all that stuff, we didn't have the footage to make it come out. But I can explain the way it happened. He actually went to Mogadishu, and clearly something was happening. That sort of comes out in the film with the text, but we didn't know what happened. And so we were going to go film with him back to Norway. And he said, you know what, the film's off. Don't come to Norway. And I was like, well, I have no idea what's going on. He said, meet me in Amsterdam, which was where we were going to meet him anyway. And don't bring a camera. So I went, and that's where he first told me. And he's like, listen, I have to tell you something. What I told you 10 years ago was a lie. And of course, that's what, as a filmmaker, you would want that on camera, but he didn't want to do that. And so Bryn, the producer on the film, she was with me, and we were kind of like, okay, what do we do with this now? And so then we left it for a while. And if he had decided that he wanted to stop the film, I'm not sure what we would have done. Maybe the film just would have gone away. But he did decide that after a while, that he wanted to correct the record. So to your question, what did he feel pressure? Probably, and I think he felt bad because we'd started this film and he had duped people to a certain degree in the media, so he felt he had a responsibility to do that. But having said that interview we do at the end, I mean, it's so uncomfortable, and believe it or not, that interview was 2 days long. It was. We have a very good editor. It was so uncomfortable for all of us, and I felt awful. I mean, I did give him lots of chances. I'm like, you don't have to do this. Do you not want to do this? And he just kept going and coming back. But it's clearly hard for him to do it. So I don't know if that answers your question. I think he did feel pressured in some way. We really thought long and hard, talked with all our team about this. Like, ethically, we feel we didn't pressure him. It was his decision ultimately. But sure, there was a discomfort and a pressure about it.
Thanks.
Hi. I just wanted to ask, I guess, how did you feel in the moment when I guess he told you the real truth? And I guess my second question is, I guess, how did this whole incident really change the way you see journalism as a practice? Because I know you just talked about how you did show him the film before, like, airing it to everyone else, and that's an ethical dilemma. So, like, I guess, how has it changed the way you see journalism as a practice as well?
Sure. Okay. Good question. So first, how did I feel? I actually burst into tears, which was, and my first thought wasn't about the journalism, like, which maybe it should have been, like, thinking, oh no, I wrote like the worst, thing that you can do in journalism, print something that's not correct. But I just instantly kind of grasped why he'd done that. And I thought, oh my God, he's had to hold this for 10 years. Like, he is breaking down because he's had to put on this persona. And I made him, was part of the reason that he had to do this. So I felt terrible for him and for what we were doing. It just felt awful. And we needed, again, this was nice that we had NFB and TVO because they were patient. Because usually with films, you have a delivery date and you have to, it's a business. They were really good in putting things on hold till we sorted all this. In terms of, how do I feel about journalism writ large? I'm pretty happy that this coincided with me being out of daily journalism. Again, as I said earlier, I still miss it quite a bit to some degree, but it's different pressures when you have, when I'm able to do this long form type of journalism now, magazines, books, documentaries, not on the daily beat. It's just easier. I think there's still, having said that though, I think there's still wonderful journalism being done. And I think it hasn't soured me on journalism or what we do, really. And even that story, I mean, it's in the grand scheme of it, I mean, we made a whole film about it, but the lie is so minor in my mind, really. I mean, the essence of the story is still there. And I'm not saying that the facts aren't all incredibly important, but it was still an important story to tell. I'm still happy for what happened with him.
Thank you.
I shouldn't tell journalism students. Yeah, no, journalism sucks. Get into accounting, guys.
Don't go to accounting.
I think time for one last question.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for being here. I think a lot of us here are journalism students, and I think from whatever school you're coming from, you could probably agree that we've been told since basically day one that family and friends shouldn't be used as sources. And I'm wondering what happens when a source becomes a friend, as obviously happened with you. Did you ever feel an ethical dilemma around that? And also, did no one else flag that?
Good questions. Yeah, I mean, I haven't had a case like this, and it did absolutely proved problematic in making the film and later stories, and wanting him to be something like you're just protecting him basically the whole time. But it was also such a unique situation. You know, I think usually it's more important when you try and keep that firewall, and I think in other ways we pretty much do. It's more getting too cozy with, say, like you're an Ottawa reporter or a Washington reporter, and then you often see, you know, journalists out with politicians and the bureaucrats. Of course, there's going to be some socializing, but it's when those relationships become so strong that you're not holding people to account to power. Ismail wasn't someone with power. You know, he was, you know, a quote unquote victim in this. So it's a little bit different in that sense. And I think, you know, it's not like we were best of friends or anything, but I mean, it only made sense to keep in touch. And there's lots of people that I have written about over the years, you know, mothers who have lost their kids, lots of stories that I've done on the terrorism beat where I have kept in touch with people. So it's kind of a case by case, but you can't be such a robot that you're not going to establish relationships. It's just important ethically that you're not going to be swayed in what you report.
And also important to be transparent. I think so much of the value of this, as uncomfortable as it must have been, is the transparency that you showed, where you were like, yeah, I feel like he's a younger brother. You talk about feeling like you might be a parent. Like having that transparency, I think, is really, really valuable to audiences, but hopefully also for the people involved.
Yeah.
Like we're going to like sources. We're going to have relationships with sources. But if we can put on our reporter brains during an interview and when we're crafting a story, I think that source is still valuable as a source.
Yeah. And in the end, I mean, it was really hard to do, but the journalism, we did correct the record. You know, the truth did come out in the end, thanks to him, like nothing to do with my digging. I didn't uncover anything. He just decided that he wanted to tell it. And then he had the bravery to go forward and we did. So, you know, for all those sort of ethical quandaries, in the end, the story did come out.
And thank you so much for doing this. It was such a privilege for all of us to have you here to be able to watch. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much for the questions.